So our next speakers that we have today are Dr. Teresa Long and Dr. Amy Fairchild. I'm going to make both of you co-host here. Would you like to introduce yourselves and start this little Q&A?
Well, good afternoon. I'm Teresa, I think it says that. And I think I saw someplace Dr. Fairchild's name come up, but I'm not, there she is.
Yes, I'm here.
It's sort of like Hollywood Squares, isn't it here? So very good. And thank you, Bucky. Actually, it was a super interesting end of the last conversation. So again, thank you to SDES for hosting what really is, I think, such an opportunity and really an occasion to learn, to share, to think about meaning today, where we are and where we need to be going. But obviously it's a look back as we consider this. So again, thank you for hosting this, and thank you, Dean Fairchild, Amy, for being willing to share some thoughts. If you don't know, to those gathered, Dr. Fairchild is the Dean of the OSU College of Public Health. I would go on, but I would share that she's a renowned public health historian, an ethicist, and a policy advocate. So with that in mind, I know she also has a deep and a thoughtful connection to HIV and AIDS and to the quilt. And so I know our time is brief today, Dr. Fairchild, Amy.
Amy's fine.
Okay. So I appreciate your willingness to share a few thoughts with us and your experiences today. So, and just a time check. Do you think, Amy, you're going for 15, 20 minutes? What do you think? Is that about right?
I'm in it. Yeah,
Okay.
I think that's about right. But I'm like a gas. I will fill the space that I'm given.
Right. So for those of you, if Dr. Fairchild needs to leave us, I'd be happy to chat about some of my experiences as well, but we're really focusing on Dean Fairchild's. So let's get going then. So could you start by telling us kind of your connection to HIV and AIDS?
Well, sure. I'm happy to do that. And thank you, Teresa. And thank you for all of you for coming together on an important moment of memory. So I really began to, I mean, of course, I remember as a high school kid beginning to hear about HIV, AIDS on the national news, but it really wasn't until I went to New York to do my MPH at Columbia University in the late 1980s that I began to focus on some policy issues related to the history of infectious disease, related to the ethics of infectious disease, and certainly AIDS was enormously relevant at that moment in time, and it was the grounds in which both historians and ethicists were beginning to use to enter the field of public health in a new kind of way. And it was really in the early 1990s when I worked at the New York State Department of Health AIDS Institute. I worked there from about 1990 to 1993 in the policy unit. And the policy unit was really an advocacy unit at that moment in time. And a lot of my colleagues were people living with HIV, people living with AIDS. We worked closely with communities affected by HIV and affected by AIDS. And what that period of time taught me was really an appreciation of, it gave me a sense of fear, not fear of the people I was working with. It gave me fear for what we could do to people through policy. Working with folks who were living with HIV, living with AIDS, made the consequences of policy real for me. It made what was a pandemic real for me. And it gave me a fear of the kind of harm we could do at the policy level, and a fear of not doing right by those people that we affected. And that's been something that has stayed with me all of these years, and something I carry over into the terrain of COVID as well.
Yeah, that actually, it's an interesting interplay to be sitting at a place. And for those of you who don't know, Dr. Fairchild is actually leading the Safe and Healthy Campus effort, and so has been incredibly busy for the entire year, helping us all both to understand it, but to move through this and create a safe learning environment and a place to be, and keeping everyone informed as we can. So kind of this juxtaposition of one pandemic that continues, but this new one that's cropped up, it feels as if there's lots of lessons to be learned. So I appreciate that. And the doing of right, that's a really interesting thing. So let me just, as far as, and maybe you've already gone there, Amy, but personally for you, obviously professionally, it was a big part of what you were doing. One of your mentors, I know Ron Bayer, has been all about it. I was in San Francisco at the time, and we were all kind of like, wow, he's amazing. But it must have meant a lot to you personally as well.
Well, it did, and it was really a personal connection that pulled me farther into AIDS. And the first AIDS death that I experienced came right after I came to Columbia. Our department chair, who was, you know, the typical sociologist who wore tweed coats with patches and but wore a bow tie every single day, and who was a very lovely, but I also felt like a very straight-laced person, took a semester-long sabbatical, and nobody knew where he'd gone. We knew he was going to California, but even his closest friends he hadn't told that he was going to be with his son, who was dying in Los Angeles. And when he came back, he shared this with everybody, and he shared it with faculty members, with staff members, and with students who were staff. So I was a research assistant at that time, and his family invited us all to a big memorial service for his son on campus, and it was such a loving, personal, vulnerable tribute to somebody who had died, and it opened up the life and the loss of parents, of siblings. I'm sorry, I'm crying.
We weren't sure we were going to get through this.
But I mean, and I think that's important to see, because I think AIDS can sometimes feel like a historical event to a new generation of folks. But Teresa, as you said, it's still a pandemic that we grapple with globally. The loss of life is not on the scale that it was at that moment in time. But what that did was it brought to life, for me, someone who had just died. So when I think of the quilt, I think of Ezra Litwak, who I think has not one but two patches on the quilt, and it makes me remember that each of those squares is a rich story. It's a story of beauty. It's a story of pain. It's a story of love, because that square wouldn't be there without love. But it's also a story of loss. It reminds us that we're more than numbers.
Absolutely. And Amy, thanks for sharing that. As some of you may know, I was on the opposite coast of Dr. Fairchild. I started my medical training actually in the late 70s, but was in San Francisco from the day we first saw the MMWR report of what was going on through 1986. And it was an amazing time. And you just mentioned the quilt, and if we get time at the end or at some point, I'll share perhaps a bit more, because one thing you point out, Dr. Fairchild, is fear. And there was a lot of fear and a lot of shame and a lot of stigma. And I would say we're watching some of that these days, even around COVID. And I can tell you that's bad for your health. And it's bad for your families, and it's bad for your partners, your friends, and it's really bad for building community. So these are things to keep in mind. But thinking about the quilt itself, it was conceived of by a gay activist, an LGBTQ activist in San Francisco, who had kind of a crazy, wild idea. It took him a while to put it together, but it was all about memory. And it was about, let's remember, let's never forget. These lives were so important, so beautiful, that we need to celebrate it, but we also can use it as a powerful tool for advocacy. So let me change to that kind of a mode, because I know you think about that as well. So the quilt, and it's the largest, as you know, the largest piece of art in the world. It's now moved from what had been a permanent home for a while in Atlanta. It's now home in California. I'm happy about that. It's so big, it can't be shown really, though there was an intention a year ago to show it. So hopefully as we move through COVID, we'll see it again. But I guess what do you think the quilt means today? And how should we think about that, as our nation and our world moves forward?
Yes. Well, and my hope is that the quilt can have new meaning today, um, in light of COVID, because it has been so long since, as a society, and COVID. I don't want to at all downplay the impact of AIDS, but the reach of COVID in terms of the fear, in terms of the stigma, I think has been farther, because we've all felt vulnerable in a sense, to let me put it this way, have come to appreciate an an idea, and the Bill Miller puts it this way: your health is my health, and my health is your health. It really underscores the ways in which we are interconnected. Um, and it's important to remember that this is an experience that connects us not only in a moment of time, but across moments in time, and look back to that moment in time. And as we're looking to AIDS for lessons, don't just treat it as a policy example, but treat it with a kind of gravity and respect and an appreciation. So I think it is hard today to understand and to remember that at the time you came into AIDS, at the time I came into AIDS, it was a death sentence. Um, at one time, the stigma of AIDS could cause the loss of family members, of friends, of job, of income in addition to life. At one time, the fear of government intervention in the lives of people with AIDS was, for many groups, greater than the fear of the disease itself. And that tells you something, that activists were afraid of AIDS, but the kind of damage that we as a society could do through stigma, through discrimination, was even a cause for greater fear. And so I think the quilt is our connection to that history, and it's a connection to history that we need to infuse into our lives today as we think about this moment, and not lose that sense of connection to one another as we move forward, as we move beyond years where we're all made to feel vulnerable by COVID-19. We may never be out of it. We may never be truly post-pandemic. We all like to talk about the post-pandemic time. It may be years before we're there, but we'll move out of a period of time, at least in this country, where we feel personally so vulnerable. But having that memory of being vulnerable, having that memory of how fragile our connections to other people can be, I think is something that the quilt can help us remember. And I think too, it helps us to think simultaneously in terms of populations, because it was by thinking in populations, by acting at the policy level, by making structural changes that made a difference in people's access to care, in people's lives. It was by thinking in populations that we made such a huge change and made such huge strides forward. But we have to simultaneously think in terms of populations, but also think in terms of individuals. And that continues to be a challenge with COVID. So we have to understand the communities that this has hit hardest, and why it's hit those communities hardest. So we have to go, and we have to move beyond just thinking that we need to educate individuals in that those communities. We have to think about, how do we change the rules of the game for people in those communities. And so we can't lose sight of those individuals that we have lost. And in the case of COVID, we're talking, I think the most recent statistic I heard was that 1 in 3 families have lost somebody. And it's important to remember that they're not just numbers.
And that's what the quilt does for us so well, is it's not just numbers. So gosh, I would love to keep going because I have lots of questions and thinking, but I know we're almost at time. And I know that I just saw the last speaker. So our work is not done even around HIV. I would, speak to the role of continuing to both understand, but obviously to push forward, whether it's with PrEP, with treatment. I can assure you that there's still a lot of shame and stigma that happens around HIV and concern around that, even in this community.
Hmm.
But let me just stop and ask, we do have some other participants. Would you be willing to stick around for another question if people have a question or two to ask you?
Me? Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely.
So are there questions from the group? And I see Bucky there. I saw that there were other questions, other people in attendance, but do people have just thoughts or questions? One thing that I'm just curious about, since we're talking about the quilt as such a powerful tool for both memory, but to take it forward in advocacy, have you had thoughts about what we might think of around COVID for doing that?
Is that a question for me? Is that a question
That's
for
a
the group?
question for you.
Well, I saw something and it reminded me of the quote. I saw something in the Times. I don't know if you looked at it, their piece on that was objects of it, just pictures of objects that family members associated with some way they had lost to COVID. And they were things like paintbrushes and figurines and sweaters. But it's to me it's that same kind of idea that the quilt is something tactile. We think of quilts as something that cover us, that warm us, and objects in that same way are tactile. They're things you have shared with somebody, that you have passed between people, and I don't know, I guess they kind of evoke that. I mean, this is going to sound religious, and I'm not coming at this from a religious place, but that in that old idea of communion, that you take a common object and you pass it around. And I think that's something that the quilt evokes too. It's physical, it's tactile, even though we don't touch it, but in the ways it's been displayed, it's laid out so you could walk out around among it, but there aren't ropes and barriers that have been put up that separate you in the same way that you'd be separated from art. So I guess in that way, it's kind of like the Vietnam Memorial too, that individuals are represented in different ways that you can reach out and touch in a sense.
And it was made by everyone,
Yeah.
and many countries have them, but have quilts now as well. But there's something about the folk art, the participation, and the creation of sometimes great beauty, sometimes maybe not so great beauty, but that are all, in loving memory of someone to be celebrated, but that we actually participated in the creation of that. I think that's a really powerful thing.
Yeah.
Just you're even holding up items. I'm sure that we'll see things, whether it's masks or small items, yes, things that people cared about. I think it's really important to have those kinds of things. It helps us all. So thank you for that.
It does.
Are there other questions for Dr. Fairchild?
Yes, I have a question. So how do we continue to, fight for HIV/AIDS activism, awareness, and the importance of STI testing, things like this, while we are in the middle of another pandemic? Like COVID is taking the main stage right now, but how do we make sure that we don't let people start falling through the cracks when it comes to their sexual and reproductive health?
I think that's a great question, Bucky. Thank you. I personally approach it from the perspective of public health infrastructure. So it's a moment to invest in public health infrastructure. People are hearing the language of testing, they're hearing the language of treatment. So I think one of the things we have to be prepared is to begin to step up the public conversation about the infrastructural needs and remind people it's not just COVID, it's not just opioids. AIDS, HIV continues to be a problem in this country, and it continues to be a problem globally. And it's one that we're not going to address without public conversation, without public money, but without the infrastructure that we need in place to know where the needs are and to get resources to those areas.
Thank you.
Actually, I would add to that. I think it's an appreciation of that it's not gone. And that's why this is a really important opportunity. And I know that there have been a lot of folks who've rallied around for this, because we know that the infection is still there. I had a brother and a sister-in-law who just returned a little bit ago from working in South Africa on HIV and AIDS for the Peace Corps. And it's pretty amazing, some of the stories that they've shared. So we should not let it go, but also look for those intersections. So infrastructure for sure, but PrEP was a really good example. When that came on the scenes, it was somewhat slow to move out, and we just heard a little bit about that. And that's completely wrong. We had to, even here in Columbus, kind of step up and kind of shake people up and say, this is an amazing tool that we need to have everyone understand. And we want people who may be at risk to both better understand it and to participate. And we need providers to do that.
Mhm.
So there's kind of a spectrum, I guess, both from individual understanding and activism all the way up, as Dr. Fairchild was just speaking to, of kind of the infrastructure and kind of the systemic response as well
Yeah.
around HIV.
Yeah, and I would add there too. So I mean, I can remember when PrEP came out, and there was a lot of skepticism. I was one of the people who was skeptical that given the cost, we were going to be able to roll this out, uh, you know, particularly globally. And I think it's a lesson to remember to think big, and to be optimistic and to assume that you can do this, and that that if you organize, if you advocate, you can find the resources to do something. That you can create a sense of urgency and a sense of need, and that's one of the lessons I take away from that moment. Yes, it's important to be pragmatic, but also it's important to think big. And if you think about how far we've come, and with HIV/AIDS, it's a remarkable story. It's one that continues, and we don't want it to fall off the radar as kind of we ebb and flow in terms of our concern uh, about infectious diseases. But I do think that the lessons from that are, be bold.
And completely. So let me pose, Amy, a question that's just come up from Anna in the chat that's really good, which is, well, they're all really good. Do you see a connection in stepping up around racism and anti-racist work, and also STI education?
Oh, absolutely. And I think particularly when you're talking about STIs, that's one of the places where this American narrative of individual responsibility tends to take hold the strongest. I mean, we see it in some cases in COVID, but COVID, I think it's easier for us to see the ways in which structure determines whether you get ill or not. But around STIs, I think personal responsibility is so ingrained in our way of thinking as Americans. So I do think that it's an opportunity to educate people about how to think beyond individual choice. How do you go beyond simply thinking that the goal is to educate people to make good decisions, and to begin to look at the structures that shape the distribution of resources, that shape opportunities, that fundamentally shape our choices, and make us have to rethink choices. Like, and I'll just use the example of tobacco. So, in what circumstances is actually tobacco use a rational choice when you're in some situations dealing with lots of different kinds of stress. So I think that the intersection of maybe, I hope, a national moment of reckoning with racism as a public health crisis, having that intersect with COVID, but also having it intersect with STI, can maybe help to shake some of the foundations that we just need to behave better when it comes to sexually transmitted infections. That the behaviors, the problem, bad choices, the problem, bad decisions are the problem.
Right. And I think that's exactly right. I would just also respond, Anna, that, and you're probably involved in this, but these social determinants of health that Dr. Fairchild just alluded to, they are so impactful in different ways, whether you have access to a job, a good job, or transportation, or where you are housed or not housed. All of these have such implications, and how you feel about yourself, about others in your lives, if you have others in your life. And these are such strong forces. And race is a layer on top of that that just drives so much of whether it's the opportunity for a healthy choice or a not so healthy choice. And you may have no choice except to go there. So I do think that there's no doubt that both STIs and HIV as an STI can be bloodborne as well, but there's no doubt that racism has a strong component, and the systems that we've created that lead to lack of opportunity and choice. So it's a great question. And actually now I'm thinking, oh, there's another question too. And Amy, maybe you just saw it.
Yeah, and I'm just realizing that they're coming up in chat. No, I did, and about the the stability of the U.S. healthcare system. I guess I tend to think of it in another way. I think of it as a powerful healthcare system. I think of it as an expensive healthcare system, but I don't think of it as necessarily stable because not everybody has access to it. So I would call it European healthcare systems as being far more robust and far more stable. And one of the things I wonder if I think it's not surprising that there are cracks in the foundation, and I think it shows you too where we've invested. We've invested in the things that potentially make us better or make us less sick after structure has had its way with us. And we need to be shifting investment to the things that prevent us from needing the healthcare system in the first place. But certainly the cost of care is itself one of the social determinants of health. To the extent that people don't have health insurance, they end up spending money on healthcare that they could spend on food, that they could spend on energy, that they could spend on living in places that gave them a better infrastructure. So I think we have a long way to go in terms of what the healthcare infrastructure needs to look like for all people.
Well, I think that was a great response. I would just simply call attention to the UN report, the Organization of Economic and Community Development, that said back in the early 2000s that there basically are two kinds of nations. And those ones that provide access to care and all kinds of social support and services versus those that don't. And the ones that do, they categorize them as WITT nations. We're in this together, a feeling of collective responsibility, versus other countries that they called YOYO, or yo-yo countries. That's you're on your own. And no surprise really that the United States goes pretty much to the top of the you're on your own category. And you can look around, and honestly, I do think this question is powerful because in some ways, there has been tons of care and tons of investment, which we're reaping the benefit of around the vaccine. But we still have many people who don't have access to care and who, for all kinds of reasons that we just talked about, may not have easy access to that vaccine. Whereas other countries they may be slower at rolling out and they may not have as much access to vaccine, but they're making sure that everybody gets access. So not sure that's the response that people were looking for, but I think that feels like the reality of where we are. So, wow, Bucky, I see we're at 2:29. I hate to ask for another question because I know that we have another speaker. So I guess I would simply close, and Amy, if you have a closing thought, but just to thank you both for your insights, for your work. You're certainly one busy leader here at OSU, and keeping kind of the fires definitely burning and helping support everyone across campus on this pandemic. And it's been pretty much nonstop 24/7 for over a year. That's a lot. So it's an incredible year for you. It's an incredible year for the College of Public Health. And actually, I would say it's an incredible year for public health. And some of us, I know I will be participating. I know there's one or two others who are in the chat, perhaps, who will be participating in a panel thinking about kind of HIV, what happened in the 80s, 90s, what's happening now from 3 to 4:30. So I invite others to join us for that. But Amy, thank you. And any closing parting thoughts for all of us?
No, well, it was my pleasure to be here, and I think I would end with thinking about the metaphor of the quilt. We're all part of the same fabric. Even though we leave parts of our society behind, and that we're not true to this notion that we're all in this together, we are all part of the same fabric. And to the extent that we don't recognize that, we do that to the detriment of the whole.
Beautifully said. Thank you so much. Thanks, Dr. Fairchild. Have a good rest of your day. I know it's going to be
Thank you. All right. You all have
Alrighty.
fun. Thank you for having
Okay.
me.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.